When you eat an apple, you probably expect that apple to nourish you about as much as apples always have. But actually, the average apple has 38% fewer nutrients than the same kind of apple did in 1950. It's a drastic drop, and it's not just apples. Green beans have lost more than half their calcium. Asparagus lost almost half its vitamin A. Broccoli has less iron. What is going on? There are a couple of big factors leading to this precipitous drop in nutritive value. One of them you probably already know about, but you may not realize the scale of it. Modern produce is bred and sometimes genetically engineered for consistent, attractive appearance, for size and yield, for resistance to pests and pesticides, and for durability in transport and storage. People who grow the occasional variety might breed for flavor. Grapefruit has become much, much sweeter and less bitter than it was in even just the 1970s. But nutritional value almost never gets considered as an important element. So you can grow an heirloom tomato in your garden that's fragile and lumpy and absolutely delicious, and also has more vitamin C and lycopene than a grocery store tomato. But those heirloom varieties are never going to be grown in massive numbers for grocery stores or for McDonald's hamburgers because they're really delicate. They squish easily, they rot in transit, and they're weirdly shaped. They don't produce consistent slices. So most grocery store tomatoes end up hard and flavorless and not as good for us as they should be because they're not being selected for that. They're being selected for they last a long time in the trucks, and they look pretty good. So this is not just tomatoes, it's true across all kinds of crops around the world. We've been selecting for things other than nutrition, so nutrition has frequently lost out. But that's only one of the pieces. Beyond human selection for other criteria, there's another enormous force that's been reducing the nutritional value of our food crops, and that one has only just recently started to be noticed. It turns out, as atmospheric CO2 levels have been rising, which they've been doing faster and faster ever since the Industrial Revolution, changing the weather patterns and raising the sea levels. They also make the plants grow faster, which sounds like that at least would be a good thing. But it doesn't mean we get more of the same plant that we used to. What actually happens is the plants develop more sugars and less protein and some of the other nutrients. In 2018, a group of Chinese scientists found that elevated atmospheric CO2 enhances the yield of vegetables and could also affect their nutritional quality. They said, we conducted a meta-analysis using 57 articles consisting of 1,015 observations and found that elevated CO2 increased the concentrations of fructose, glucose, total soluble sugar, total antioxidant capacity, total phenols, total flavonoids. So some of these are vitamins that they found higher. Ascorbic acid and calcium in the edible part of vegetables by 14.2%, 13.2%, 17.5%, 59%, 8.9%, 45.5%, 9.5%, and 8.2%, respectively, but decreased the concentrations of protein, nitrate, magnesium, iron, and zinc by 9.5%, 18%, 9.2%, 16%, and 9.4%. So that was in 2018, and that was a meta-analysis. So they were looking at other people's studies. Just earlier this year, a group of Dutch scientists published a study in which they actually grew 43 different crops under different atmospheric CO2 levels. They actually pumped CO2 at the plants in an enclosed environment. And all 43 crops showed reduced nutrient content under elevated CO2 levels, including wheat and rice, which most people in the world depend on as staple foods. The plants in higher CO2 levels developed higher levels of sugars and lower levels of protein, vitamins, and beneficial minerals, especially zinc and iron. The details varied by species, but all the crops tested were less nutritious in levels of CO2 we have now than in older, lower levels, and even less so in levels we'll have in the near future. So this is a problem. If the same plant food has more sugar calories and fewer vitamins and minerals than it used to, that means those of us who can are going to have to eat more of it to get the same value. And in the process, we're over consuming carbohydrates. Over consuming carbohydrates leads to obesity and diabetes and other poor health outcomes. And for marginal communities who aren't going to be able to raise their intake, maybe they can't grow anymore or they can't buy anymore, they're just going to have nutritional deficiencies, malnutrition, specific deficiencies in vitamins and minerals. And that's especially true for communities that are dependent on a single crop, such as rice. And it's not even just food crops that are being affected by rising CO2 levels. It's all plants everywhere, including wild plants, including crops raised for animal feed, which might explain why purebred lab animals that have been eating the same measured portions of the same special diets since the 1960s keep becoming more and more overweight. I haven't actually seen anyone put these two things together, but I did as I started reading about this. Wild animals are going to be hitting the same issues of needing to eat more to get the same vitamins, minerals, and proteins, and their bodies aren't adapted to know they need to make that change and or to handle the additional carbohydrates that are going to come along with it, and their environments may not allow them to simply up their intake. So we'll likely start seeing nutritional issues in wild animals, and that'll vary by species and by their diet. It's also going to affect medicinal plants in unpredictable ways, and even building materials are going to be affected. I know that modern pine lumber is considered inferior to pine lumber from 100 years ago because the new stuff is weaker because it grew faster. These things seem connected to me. So this matter of growing faster and differently in higher CO2 turns out to have a lot of disastrous implications. What can we do about it? Well, as an individual, not a whole lot. You can choose to grow some heirloom tomatoes at home or to buy them from small farmers, but they're still going to be less nutritious than the same variety 50 years ago. You can raise your overall intake of vegetables. You can focus on those with less sugar and starch, and that should help you personally. You can donate money to food banks so they can buy more fresh vegetables, which they're always short on. But most people aren't getting even the currently recommended 5 fruit and vegetable servings a day, and raising it for everybody on the planet is probably not achievable. So we really need systemic change. There are many scientists working on biofortification, methods of directly increasing nutrients in plants, but this has to be done one nutrient and one variety at a time, and we're never going to be able to catch up to the pace of loss. Farmers can adapt their approaches somewhat. For instance, they can select varieties that do better in higher CO2 levels. They can harvest them earlier. They can use soil amendments and fertilizers that concentrate the nutrients that are becoming lacking. But the big thing we can do is we need to push for effective climate change measures. We have to reduce dependence on carbon-releasing fossil fuels and shift to wind, solar, geothermal, hydroelectric, maybe even nuclear power. I know that has its own problems, but we've got to shift it. It's absolutely necessary. We need to produce and use power in ways that don't fry our planet. Maybe not letting tech companies build Gen AI data centers that are going to be as big as like India's power use like they're planning. Maybe making power companies into publicly owned utilities as they are in most European countries instead of privately held companies, so they're better positioned to serve the public good and to make systemic changes when they need to. Shifting from what is increasingly obviously end-stage capitalism to a more socialist form of economy that doesn't rely on the impossibility of never-ending growth and profit is also absolutely necessary. We need systems of food production that are designed for the nurturing of human health and sustainable soil and water management, not the short-term profit of shareholders. As long as we're driven by short-term profit of shareholders, we're going to keep driving ourselves into disasters like crashing our nutritional value of our food. We simply cannot go on as we have been because the way we've been doing it keeps making things worse, including stuff we need to live. We need political and economic structures that serve humanity and the environment in long-term sustainable ways. So, eat your vegetables and write your congresspeople to protect those vegetables. Thank you.